The vulnerabilities that we will talk about in today's panel, which is called The Last Girl and Her Vulnerabilities to Sex Trafficking, ranges from poverty, of course, caste, which in India is a bit like race, where people are forced into certain occupations just because they are born into certain caste groups. And of course, race in America, indigenous status, ethnicity, and how that cuts off access from the very basic needs to food, clothing, shelter, education, sometimes housing, and very, very often even legal protection. And how that cutting off of access then leads to our hunger, homelessness, which traffickers take advantage of to pimp girls and women into prostitution, and how this is all driven by a demand for prostituted girls and women, which drives the sex industry, the sex buyers. So we will talk about this. We have a wonderful panel with us today, and they represent all corners of our world to show how ubiquitous this problem is, cutting across continents from Africa to Asia to the United States to North America, and also cutting across cultures, to show what is so common in our inequalities. And I have what I call the last girl on my panel, and I'm so honored and privileged to have these last girls. I myself am Ruchira Gupta. I'm from India. I'm the founder of Apne Women Worldwide, an anti-sex trafficking organization which helps more than 20,000 girls and women who are trafficked into prostitution because of the fact that they are poor, female, low-caste teenagers, and because of the fact that there are men who want to buy them and exploit them, and so traffickers see a profit in it. Today, I have with me Rebecca Bender. Rebecca is the founder and CEO of the Rebecca Bender Initiative. She's an award-winning, nationally recognized expert on human trafficking, and she escaped 6 years of modern-day slavery. She wrote her first book, Roadmap to Redemption, and now she has 2 more books. She's taught more than 86,000 law enforcement officers through online courses what trafficking means and how to go after traffickers and help survivors. She has won lots of awards, from the Female Overcomer Award to the Unlikely Hero Award, and she lives in the Pacific Northwest and supports FBI and other law enforcement agencies to go after traffickers. She's a true hero, and she flew down from Oregon to be with us today. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
I will then introduce Shanie Roy, who's sitting next to Rebecca. Shanie is pursuing a Master's of Law at the University of Quebec in Montreal, Canada. She has participated in many collaborative projects to talk about the conditions of women at work and how sexual harassment is so ubiquitous in workplaces for women that often there is a continuum between sexual harassment in the workplace to a job which is sexual harassment itself, prostitution. She herself was a victim of sexual exploitation, and from the ages of 15 to 19, and now she participates as a survivor advocate. Thank you, Shanie, for coming from Canada. And I have with me Meji, a survivor activist from South Africa and a program associate for Survivors Initiative at Embrace Dignity in South Africa. Mickey is a feminist. She dreams of a world just like all of us, in which no girl or woman is bought or sold. She supports Embrace Dignity to do tremendous outreach in Cape Town and all over South Africa to make sure that survivors' voices are heard and laws and policies can reflect that. She's also trying to build a network across Southern Africa so that more survivors can get to find their voice and collaborate with organizations like Coalition Against Trafficking in Women and other organizations to be able to make sure that there is a collaboration between lawyers and survivors and prosecutors and anyone else who wants to join in. And last but not least, I have with me Cynthia Stephen. She is an independent social policy researcher and analyst. She's also an independent journalist. She's from Bangalore, from my country, India, and she has been doing unprecedented advocacy for Dalit women's rights and writing about Dalit women's issues in media, which often tends to invisibilize Dalit issues. And on top of that, Dalit women's issues even more so. She represents 3 kinds of perspectives in India. She represents Dalit women, women and girls, marginalized sections of India, and she's also trying to influence higher education in India to make sure that not just Dalits get scholarships to college, but also what their lived experience is reflected in curricula. She's the president of Training, Editorial and Development Trust, TEDS Trust, and is based in Bangalore, and is luckily here with us all the way from India to talk about a number of Dalit women who are trapped in systems of prostitution in India, and how a mindset which is both sexist and casteist says that certain Dalit women should be sexually available, and how she keeps trying to challenge this by saying it's not okay and Dalit women do not want to be sold into prostitution. So thank you, Cynthia Stephen. And now I will start by asking Rebecca to speak for 10 minutes, and followed by Shanie 10 minutes, Mickey 10 minutes, and Cynthia 10 minutes. And then after that I have a wonderful audience of people who have trooped up on this snow day from the Carter Center, Karen Ryan, Taina Bien Ami from Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, SOHE, who's come all the way from Turin and represents many organizations including CATW in Iroko, and Marina and Dorchen Leidholt from Sanctuary for Women and Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and Apne, and Tinku Khanna from Apne in India, who will be asking us questions so that we have a rich discussion. Thank you, everyone. Rebecca.
Thank you. Thanks so much for allowing me to be here. I'm honored to sit on the panel with all of you. And what a great group of so many different diverse stories and diverse areas that we all get to serve. And one thing that I believe comes in to play, especially when we're talking on a global scale about exploitation, is that trafficking looks really different based on the culture and the community that you live in. And it doesn't mean that it is different, it just can sometimes appear to be different. How it looks in Nigeria, especially recently, based on, versus how it looks in Cambodia, versus New York City, versus small town America. It all looks very different based on the culture and the community that you live in. Polaris had a really great research report that came out last year on the 25 different types of exploitation that exist in our world. And until we start really understanding, I think, all of those complexities, it's harder because we want to only envision one type of human trafficking. That one thing we saw in that one movie, that one time is what we tend to imagine, and it's complex and it can look different based on where you live and the community that you're involved in. And I know for me specifically, and the community that I serve, I came from a small rural town in America. I was taught stranger danger, but I wasn't really taught anything about my vulnerabilities. I wasn't taught about predators that were wanting to expand my boundaries of commercial sex and hypersexuality. I wasn't taught how to look for potential brainwashing. I wasn't taught any of that. I was just taught stranger danger, don't take the candy, right? And so I grew up in this culture that envisioned human trafficking as only kidnapped kids in a third world country. And when I found myself in a situation that didn't match that narrative, I didn't know I could ask for help. I thought, well, I must have chosen this. Oh, I must have made a bad decision. And I grew up in kind of what would be a normal middle-class American home, but a small-town America, so typically it would have been lower class looking at a national scale. But in that community, it was fairly normal. My parents divorced when I was young, and it was an ugly divorce. Those years during that really hard time created vulnerabilities in me that while may not have been extreme as those that unfortunately we do serve today, still creates vulnerabilities. And I think it's important to know that all youth have a vulnerability, and traffickers are looking for vulnerabilities in young people so that they can exploit them. They can hold the answer over their head like a carrot and lure them away from their support groups, from their family and friends, get them in dangerous situations that are hard to get out of, self-blame, and then abuse comes into play and trauma. In our state, in the state of Oregon specifically, 95% of trafficked teenagers have been in foster care since age 2. 95% of our trafficked youth in my state have been in foster care since age 2. Now, they weren't exploited till maybe between ages of 13 and 15. We had a huge gap in their lives in this moment between 2 to 13, just speaking generally, that someone could have intercepted. Someone in a community could have come in and gotten involved in our young people's lives. They could have signed up for Big Brother, Big Sister. They could have been that coach at school, whether it's soccer or Boys and Girls Club. I just think that we need to start really looking at these complexities of vulnerabilities and figuring out where our influence is, what my circle of influence and my skill set and my profession is that might actually allow me to start engaging in systemic changes for vulnerable people groups in our own communities. I think sometimes as a movement, we can go so quickly to prevention or restoration or policy reform, all of which are needed. But we tend to forget these age group, right, of like 2 to 13, that these young kids, we could have intercepted, and we could have been a mentor, and we could have been a teacher or a social worker that really got involved in their lives and poured value and worth and identity and purpose into them. And we didn't. And a lot of them ended up, getting lured by someone else and being promised promise and hope and future in the wrong capacity. And we've, and I'm included in that because I fell for it. And I thought this would be my answer to get out of poverty as a young mom trying to put myself through school. And that created a huge vulnerability in me, trying to figure out, now I'm the single mom at 18 years old, trying to put myself through college. I lived away from my family, so I didn't have a support group. And here came a really great offer for support at what I desperately needed. And so I didn't notice the red flags. For one, I had never been taught them. Again, I'd only taught stranger danger. I didn't notice the red flags, but it met this need that I desperately had in my life as a struggling single mom at 18. So that's, I think, part of at least the vulnerabilities for me and what I see in the people that we serve in my community. And I know that I'm excited to hear about all of the different vulnerabilities that we all get to address, and I'm sure they'll lead to lots more questions, so that's what I have for now.
Thank you, Rebecca. Shanie?
Yes. I'm from Montreal, so I speak mostly French, so English is not my first language, so I will just read a bit, but I'm still going to animate a discussion. I'm pursuing a master's degree in law, as it has been said, and I'm also a social worker. I've been working with women shelters and also battered women, and also a group working like advocacy against sexual exploitation and social housing development, especially for single mothers. I'm also a researcher doing research about access to justice, women access to justice, and women's workers' rights. I've been in the sex trade from 15 till 19 years old, as has been said, due to many social vulnerabilities that I really see in what you have just been said about your past, sexual abuse, and many men who seems to be there at the right woman, and I've lived some toxic family situation, and having the fear of supporting myself with nothing, with a little income, really pushed me into the sex trade at 16 years old, and sexual harassment at work also. My first job, I was raped, so really it pushed me to go to the sex trade. And I want to talk a bit about an overview of the sex industry in Quebec, and also talk about the access to rights and the access to justice for women who are vulnerable and who are also at risk of sexual exploitation, who have been sexually exploited. And just a little conclusion after about the importance of securing and economic security for women and girls. And in Quebec, price for girls and women are cheapest than in Canada and even in United States. So pimps sell girls and women less. So there's really a big demand for Quebec girls and women. And Montreal is really recognized worldwide for its sex industry and is considered a hub of human trafficking. But for this presentation, I will mostly talk about rural area and Aboriginal women in Quebec. So in rural areas, the recruitment of prostitutes by criminal networks varies according to the ups and downs of local economies. For example, in small city, after the closure of several factories, many pimps took advantage of the opportunity, the loss of also income. They go to see women, And in some locality, beside economic difficulty, the phenomenon of seasonal jobs and the recent restriction to the unemployment insurance plan place a lot of women in vulnerable situation and at risk of prostitution. And women do not benefit from the economic development of industry employing a large amount of men, such as road construction and natural resources exploitation. Women are excluded from the development of Quebec, and many workers travel to rural regions for employment contracts, which increase the demand for prostituted women when there's a high concentration of male workers. And about Aboriginal women, this situation disproportionately affects Aboriginal women, notwithstanding the historic and the systemic discrimination that further vulnerabilize them. But, for example, in 2013, the new development of a major mining project in northern Quebec has increased violence against Aboriginal women and has led to an increase of prostitution activity. Some Aboriginal women who used to work on the construction site lost their job to the benefit of white men who came for jobs. So they ended clothing, shelter, healthcare, and legal protection. And these needs are fundamental human rights and are supposed to be protected and should not be at that amount not respected. And prostitution should not be a way for women to cover their basic needs. Prostitution is not a form of decent work. It will never be. According to numerous sources, it's inherently in contradiction to the health and safety of persons, especially girls. And full decriminalization or legalization of prostitution isn't respecting the central principle of international human rights law, in particular the right to life, to security of person, to not be subjected to inhuman treatment, to be protected from discrimination, to just and favorable condition of works, to a standard of living adequate. These are all international recognized human rights. And for quite a while now, Catherine McKinnon, a distinguished lawyer and feminist activist, brilliantly demonstrated all this in the article Prostitution and Civil Rights, which apply more particularly in the US context. But women and girls facing sexual exploitation should have access to justice, as guaranteed by the right to an effective remedy for acts violating the fundamental human rights. And depending on the justice system, regarding my research and what I've been working with a lot of women who have been sexually exploited, prostitute women and girls should not be decriminalized, should benefit from legal provision against all forms of pimping and against sex buyers, should have access to juridical help of quality adapt to their needs, should have access to fund helping victims of sexual exploitation, including sex trafficking and other kind of the continuum of prostitution, should be able to institute class action against those responsible, should be heard within a reasonable time, should be adequately protected from against reprisals, should have access to a specialized court or an independent civil society advisory board to assess court case. And in Canada, we're pushing Justin Trudeau federal government to sign an order implementing the provision of Bill C-452, which will, among other things, reverse the burden of proof from the victim to the pimp or the sex trafficker. This law was passed in 2013 and it's still in legislative limbo, even if Trudeau himself had voted for when he was in the opposition. So I'm making a statement on behalf of my sister from Canada to sign the bill and implement it as it has been voted like almost 5 years ago. And just to conclude, I want to talk about the importance of strengthening the economic security of precarious women, because facing wage inequality and sexual division of labor, women are subject to a sexist discrimination in labor market, and sexual harassment at work, and a set of labor law that are created around the model of the male breadwinner. So offering a way out of prostitution is through viable economic alternative. The effectiveness of rights depend on the economic independence of women. And I want to conclude with a quote from Dworkin and Prostitution Male Supremacy that she wrote in 1993. With the money, he can buy a human life and erase its importance from every aspect of civil and social consciousness, from the protection of law, from any right of citizenship, from any concept of human dignity and human sovereignty. For $50, any man can do that.
Wow. So good.
Thank you.
Well said, Shanie. And now I would ask Nikki to take off from where Shanie is left off.
Okay, that was quite
Our sister from South Africa,
Um,
after our sister from Canada.
So maybe let me start by just putting into place the context of the South African, situation with prostitution. The vast majority of women in prostitution in South Africa are black, poor women from disadvantaged backgrounds. We do have some male persons in prostitution and some trans persons as well, and some people from privileged homes as well, but the vast majority of them are these women, and they live in South Africa, so they constitute of women who are of South African origin and some of the neighboring countries, as we share some borders with different other countries. And I have been thinking about the concept of the last girl since when I heard about it from Nozizwe, and this was in 2016. And when I was asked to come and speak about the last girl, I looked around me, I looked at myself, having survived prostitution, how I got into prostitution. I remember I was made an offer by a man. I was doing about working, I was desperate, I didn't have money, looking for a job, being a young mother of 2 at that particular time. That man had driven past many women, but I was that particular girl that he chose to lure in this. And that brought me to the understanding that I was that last girl at that very moment. That man could sense this, and like Rebecca had said earlier on, that these men can sense these vulnerabilities. Because why else did he not stop for any? I was not the only person walking down Fort Checker Road on that particular afternoon. So then I looked around at the women that we work with in the movement of Kwanele. I hear a lot of stories. When I ask questions in workshops, I've got these 3 standard questions, but this particular one, what happened that you did not become what you wanted to become growing up? And it's always circumstantial. And when I look at it, it's always vulnerabilities. It's not something that any of us could have controlled. It's our past sexual, sexual and physical abuse experiences, and in some instances it's the fact that we were born into particular families with a particular social standard, and the fact that some of us were orphaned. And again, that brings me to the concept of that last girl and our vulnerabilities to sex trafficking and to prostitution and to being recruited. And again, I look at how other women enter prostitution. I see that there is a chain of younger women, of older women recruiting younger women, and then this so happened that these older women do not just recruit any girl; they always recruit this last girl. They don't just go for we have friends, we have friends across our social standards, but I would never dare go to Camps Bay and start asking my friend from Camps Bay to come into the road with me and start selling sex. But it's easier to approach the girl from Kailicha who lives in a shack, to invite her to come and sell sex. And then again, these are the vulnerabilities that the last girl are having. And then the other thing is that there has been a huge call for the decriminalization of prostitution and its recognition as work in South Africa. And one thing that I want to bring to everybody's attention is that does not reflect the voices of the women in prostitution. It actually reflects the voices of those who feel who wants to just keep us in poverty, and who feel that is what we are good enough for. And again, when we look at this situation, it's the fact that that's all you are good for. Even some quotes that have been made, are enough to tell us this. But then again, when you are that last girl, you are longing and you are desperate for a sense of belonging. So any person that approaches you and with something that looks promising, you are easily buying into that. I usually say, when the concept of decriminalization was first sold to me, it was the fact that I am here and I'm desperate and I want to make my money, and the person who is hindering this is this police guy, and if I can get him off my back, I'm not even considering at that moment the dangers that I'm exposed to, the harms and everything. What my main concern is that I make this money, I go back home so that my kids sleep, and eat and sleep. And if that cannot happen, and if this person is the person that is standing in my way, if anything that can get this person, then it becomes something that I think that I want. But in actual fact, if you speak to women without having to use big English words and terminologies of legal frameworks, because the ordinary woman in the streets of South Africa knows nothing about whether or not it's decriminalization, legalization. And to be quite frank, these women and girls could not even be concerned whether or not the Johns sometimes were arrested or not arrested. Their main concern is about themselves and about getting out of this. And also the other thing that I've noticed about these last girls is that we dream of a life when we get into prostitution, free from all forms of exploitation and oppression. So we so much think that I'm going to be in prostitution for a period. We all have time frames.
Right.
I'm going to get myself money and I'm going to start this business. Or I'm going to finance myself through school. And I'm going to, there's a lot of things, and then something happens. I'm hooked in drugs, I'm hooked in alcohol, and then now I don't save this money as fast as I thought I would save it. Yeah. So our stories vary. But then again, it brings us to the fact that we are this last girl, and how do we then get ourselves out of this situation? And like Shanice, my sister here, had said that decriminalization does not even reflect, or does not
harassment, sexual violence in the fields. When they go to collect water, Dalits are not allowed to touch the main water source in the village because their touch is considered impure. So they have to go outside the village to look for water. When the girls go out to look for water, it is entirely possible that they risk sexual violence just for getting water for their families. And that is why I say that our girls are the very, very last girls in the family. But imagine this, there is a system where the Dalit girls, their families are committed to committing their little girls, maybe 8-year-olds, to a temple, dedicating her to the temple, and because of that they become unable to marry, they then become able to be prostituted to the more powerful people. So this system is a religiously sanctioned form of prostitution. It is agreed upon by the entire community that this is the right way to go, and so we have large sections in central, in northern part of Karnataka, in southern Maharashtra, and in part of Andhra Pradesh. There's a central part of the Deccan Plateau where these practices exist. There are temples at which these rituals continue to be done, even though they have been cancelled by law, they have been banned by law. But the practice continues because there are no employment options. There are no income options. If they go to work, they don't get enough to feed themselves 1 or 2 meals a day. So why would anyone want to do agricultural work if this is the only other option? So in other words, it's a system that is extremely refined in how to exploit the girls. There is an economic system, there is a social system, there is a religious system to enable the families to bring the girls and put them into this system. And it is really unfortunate that the Devdasi system has not, in spite of the laws that exist, have not been, one, adequately implemented, two, they cannot be implemented because the people are too poor to have alternatives. And every time there's a drought, there's an increase of girls being trafficked into prostitution. So there's a very clear economic link. And so we really need to be a part of this situation where the Dalits, and as I say, it's not only in this practice is only in one part of the country, but there are other parts of the country where an entire community is expected to do this. So the men and the women follow this as a traditional occupation, and so it's a very systemic exploitation. I totally agree with what my sisters have said, what Shanie has said, what Vicky has said, that it is not possible for girls or for women to sell themselves if there were not a market. And this is truly patriarchy at work in its extreme form, where just for the price, for a small price, a human life can be purchased, and just for a little bit of money. And so we really need to work together to, and so happy to be a part of this discussion. But I just want to make one more important point, and that is that the women's movement in India, which has done very good work in organizing and advancing women's rights, a large section of women's rights movements in India do support women in sex work. And so there is an ideological gap, there is a battle to be fought, there is some more relationships to be built, bridges to be built among women who think it this way and those of us who think it the other way. And so we really need to, as sisters, to come together and help the others understand from the perspective of the trafficked child, from the perspective of the mother who was forced to undertake this option because there's no other better paying option. So we need to as women all across the world, we need to understand that we cannot be a part of a system where women's bodies, women's labor is so devalued that they have to sell their bodies to eat for themselves and their children.
Yes.
This we cannot have. And I just want to, I want to be a part of this dialogue and work with our sisters across the other side to help us understand why we cannot talk about this decriminalization of prostitution in the way they have been doing. We really need to listen to each other properly and dialogue and understand this more clearly. And I truly appreciate what Meji said about the constitution, about this point about choice. this is not a choice that just happens out of equality. It's a forced choice. It cannot be choice. It cannot be consent in the way it is understood in the broad sense. We need to talk about this. I appreciate this opportunity to be here this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you all of you for such a powerful panel. And I'll just explain in a second when we conceived of the idea, The Last Girl, it was born from a desire and a need to explain to our sisters in the women's movement and to other social justice movements who the person is who is prostituted and who is trafficked. Because very often what I found when I was talking to people and saying that we need to shift the blame from the victim to the perpetrator, and the victim is that prostituted girl or woman whose life is marked by absence of choices. Her prostitution is not a choice, and just like in domestic violence, we go and punish the perpetrators, we have to punish the perpetrators, the sex buyers and the traffickers. They would not understand. So I began to look for an idea to explain who the last girl was and who that trafficked person was, and I thought, why not call her the last girl? And the idea of the last came from 3 different people. One was a man called John Ruskin, who wrote a book called Unto the Last. And Mahatma Gandhi, who was the biggest freedom fighter in India, one of our big leaders who's believed deeply in non-violence as a method of struggle, he had read John Ruskin's book while traveling through South Africa. And that's how he decided that when he wanted to embark on any action, and he did not know what to do when he felt confused, he would think of the most vulnerable human being he knew, and that was this last person defined in John Ruskin's book, Unto the Last. And similarly, I found that Dr. Ambedkar, who's a Dalit leader who wrote India's constitution, also used the concept of the last in a concept he called untouch to describe the last born, the most marginalized human being. And I realized that both these great leaders, these 3 great leaders, are talking about the last, but nobody's applying it to women and girls who literally are the last, like the person that Mickey was when she was standing on the street corner. So I decided to feminize it by adding an A after it and called it Antyaja in Hindi, which is taking into issues of the last girl being the most vulnerable human being we know, the 13-year-old in a brothel, because she's poor, because she's female, because she's a teenager, because she's low caste in India, black in America, Native American, indigenous, or a victim of apartheid and poverty in South Africa. So she exists everywhere, and this is who the traffickers take advantage of. So when we have debates and we talk about what we want for that last girl, surely we don't want prostitution to be a job option for her. We want her to have job options which are sustainable, which are dignified, and which actually help her live a better life to her full potential. So this is why Apne, my NGO, and all of us decided this campaign called the Last Girl Campaign to bring forth the idea of vulnerabilities and interlinking vulnerabilities. In America, you call it intersectionality. In India, we call it thrice oppressed. I've heard the term double jeopardy in the past. And so she exists everywhere. And once we conceive who this last girl is, perhaps we can think about how do we decriminalize the prostituted woman, criminalize her trafficker, criminalize the John, and make sure that just like in domestic violence movement, shift the blame to stem this rot which is so evil. And I just end with an appeal and then open it up for questions. Right now in India, we have a trafficking bill pending in India's parliament. And unfortunately, the bill does not mention sexual exploitation and the prostitution of others as an offense at all, even though the United Nations, all the National Human Rights Commissions in India, every organization which has ever done any research says that 60% of those who are victims of human trafficking are victims of sexual exploitation and trafficked for the purposes of prostitution. The bill does not mention that. The bill has no budgets earmarked for investment in the basic needs of the last girl: food, clothing, shelter, education, housing, legal protection, nothing. And it has no punishment of the sex buyer mentioned. So we have started a petition online, and the petition is on change.org. If you Google Apne and look for a title saying "Make Sexual Exploitation an Offense," in India's trafficking bill, you can sign on and help us to build pressure on India's parliament. And now I'll just open up the floor for questions. Anyone? Karen? Karen from the Carter, can you introduce yourself also since we're taping the whole thing?
Hi, Karen Ryan from the Carter Center. So my question these days is for human rights organizations, people who are believers in human rights, who really hold fast to the idea that individual freedom is something we have to protect. But yet many of these organizations are arguing for decriminalizing sex buying. So the distinction between what the Nordic model, the equality model in South Africa, and that model is really the difference is that they want to also decriminalize the sex buying part. So what would each of you say, any one of you who want to, say to those people in human rights organizations who really are very well-meaning, I think, and they have the right intentions, but this is a misguided, and according to us here, we're all preaching to the choir here, but there are many of our friends who really believe that decriminalizing all aspects of the sex trade is the right way to go. So does anyone want to talk to those people?
Rebecca.
I mean, I think it's such a great point. I believe there's this real tension in a sense between those of us who we really want to empower women. We really want to empower the vulnerable, the last girls, the last boys in our society. We really want to empower human rights and human dignity. We want to be able to fight for women's fair living wages. We want to fight for the gay, gap in wages to be decreased. We want to fight for equality for LGBTB. We want to fight for equality for all of these people. Making prostitution a legal profession is actually the complete opposite than I think what people are understanding, because a profession that increases homicide, increases HIV, STD, extreme PTSD, puts people hugely at risk to leave their families to leave their children without mothers. Those type of professions go completely against the idea of empowerment by any capacity. And I think furthermore, the mere definition of objectification, when we're fighting misogyny, when we're fighting all of these issues that are surrounding with women empowerment and female objectification, it's like there's this tension between how do you fight for women's rights and get, to decrease gap in wages and to fight against misogyny, and yet try to fight for a profession that would so objectify another human being. Like they're contradicting. You can't be in that same circle. I think that prostitution should not be a choice towards a profession by any means. I think when you really pull the curtain back and you follow that string really back to the root of the issue, why people feel as if that's their only choice. I think if you were to really ask, if you had an option between a job that had flexible schedules and fair living wages, and you were treated respectfully and it was something you were proud of, would you still choose prostitution? The answer is always no. And so I think it's important for us to remember that we're fighting for equality, that we're fighting to create jobs and professions that are going to empower people, and that the definition of objectification is to be an object. This is an object. It's not empowering to be a cup, to be used to drink and to stir, and right? So the mere fact of objectification is empowerment, you're like, actually that really contradicts the actual definition. To be objectified is not to be empowered. It's actually to be used and discarded as less than, and to be put hugely at risk, and that never should be a profession that I think anyone who really cares about women's rights would actually endorse.
And I also think that human rights is always about a right of a person to fulfill their full potential. And so we have to create an environment, and that's what the human rights movement is about, so that each individual can fulfill their full potential. Now, an occupation which is inherently exploitative and has vast and dangerous and devastating physical and mental harm inherent to the way it is conducted cannot be considered a human right, because prostitution is based on body invasion. And body invasion has to have physical and mental health consequences. Repeated body invasion which is from not just sexually transmitted diseases, but repeated abortions, low intensity fever, skin diseases, tuberculosis, jaundice, insomnia, backaches, plus the violence conducted on the woman by the customers and the pimps and the brothel keepers who beat her, who shove bottles up her vagina, stab out cigarettes on her. So there is so much physical violence and there is so much disease caused from the repeated body invasion. Plus there is PTSD. Most of the women in prostitution talk about an out-of-body experience because they pretend they are not there when the customer is on top of them. And there's alienation, which the term we've heard of in all labor struggles. And this disconnect has so much PTSD, anger, insomnia, depression, sexualizing your body, desexualizing your body, dependence on drugs and alcohol to deal with this. And now research shows that women in prostitution are suffering from more PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, than even returning war vets. So something which obviously has inherent physical and mental harm inbuilt into its very nature cannot be a human right.
Yeah.
Can I? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can go.
Okay. I think that the problems for human rights activists is taking the sexual exploitation, prostitution, sex trafficking, any word. It's because they look at it as a form of work, as a form of revenue. The problem is you have to consider it as a form of violence against women, and that is the importance, because when you say sex workers' right or humans' right or workers' right, and you want to organize in this kind of vision, this is wrong, because you should look at it as battered women, as let's say, or sexually abused women. If you say that if you decriminalize abuser, sexual abuser, or decriminalize violent men in domestic situation, that it will be place girls and women less at risk. This is not true, and it's with that kind of vision that you have to look at this problem, this phenomenon of sex trade. Is with idea of violence against women, because, and I've worked with battered women, and when I realized that yes, her husband was criminalized when he bet her, when he abused her, and still yes, she maybe want to return, and she was at risk, and you know, if she returned, and maybe her child would be under child protection because she returned in a bad situation. But still, would we say that criminalizing violent men in domestic situation or sexual abuser put women at risk? No, still no. So it's really with that kind of vision for me, it's with that narrative that we have to look at the situation. But mostly human rights are activists, and still in many movements are mostly it's still male dominated, with still they come from social movement that it's still with a look, not with the priority of woman violence, violence against women, but with man problem or workers problem, and that is I think it's there's a gap between feminist women's group who look at it and other kind of background activists who look at the phenomenon.
I'd like to add.
Sorry, Nikki, you wanted to say something first?
No, I just, it gets me thinking quite a lot when people are saying that they are advocating for the rights of women in prostitution, but yet have a very strong feeling, especially in the South African context. We all agree that women in prostitution suffer a gross human rights violation at the hands of the men who buy us, at the hands of the police, at the hands of the community in general. But yet we still turn around and say we want to decriminalize these men, which takes me back 14 years from now, in 2004, when I had an incident. My finger doesn't bend, and this man wanted to kill me. This was me pulling a knife from him. And when we look back, men were only criminalized for purchasing sex in South Africa in 2007. So him not being criminalized did not prevent him from wanting to harm me. So it doesn't make him less violent, the fact that he's criminalized or non-criminalized. So it doesn't look at the issue at hand here. And then again, I look at who these men are purchasing. They would never approach, powerful women who are CEOs, who are advocates, in courts to purchase them, because they want people that they can control. So it's not empowering. Like Rebecca had said, it's not a form of empowerment. And also, it feels, if people want to realize our rights, let's look at the right to equality, because as long as you are offering me, who is the poor black woman who lives in South Africa, who's been born into a disadvantaged family, the option to be exploited for if as a means of living, it's also another issue that we are not addressing equality here. You are already starting by treating. And also, one thing that I also want to say is that sex is a very beautiful thing. We all love to have sex, but it's very liberating if I'm having sex the way I want it, when I want it, with who I want, instead of being paid to be doing sex, because now I end up doing things that I wouldn't ideally do. When we get to the street, you speak to a lot of women. There are women who are black women who strongly have a feeling that I would never, under any circumstance, date a white man. But they sleep with about 10 of them a night in prostitution. You get lesbian women who would never, under no circumstance, willingly have sex with a man. But in the streets, because they are in prostitution and this is how they need to earn a living, they are now having to enjoy having sex with men, or even just smelling the man. So again, how is this liberation to women? It doesn't liberate women, and it's not a human right at all. So it just for me, sometimes it just I just feel patronized by people, and I usually conclude to the fact that we in a country like South Africa, where we have a high rate of violence against women, especially sexual violence, which I mean in the form of rape. We never hear any of these human rights activists advocating for lenient sentences for rape perpetrators, because rape survivors are women who are well educated, powerful, because rape can happen to any person, and they feel they cannot touch it there because they know that these women are there in their midst. They are researchers, they are teachers, they are social workers, they are lawyers, even magistrates, and they can actually say, now we cannot call for that. But now the fact that they take this space and they dominate, they decide to speak on our behalf, and they decide to offer us exploitation as a means of survival, simply because we are poor and vulnerable. For me, I find it patronizing, and it really upsets me to hear people saying that I'm for human rights, but then I'm advocating for your exploiters to be given a legal license to just do so legally. Also, I mean, I would like people to start thinking about, we have studies, we have a recent one in South Africa that gave us the 9 factors that causes men to be more likely to beat or rape a woman. And men who purchase sex are 2.8 times most likely to beat or rape a woman. And men who have sexual entitlement, men who engage in transactional sex, and men with multiple sexual partners, they are like almost 5 times more likely to beat or rape a woman. And when we talk about this, these people might remove themselves from this and say, this man will beat or rape the woman in prostitution. But let's think about this. The clients or the sex buyers are actually our husbands, they are our brothers, they are our colleagues. So if this man has a potential of beating or raping a woman, not only can he rape or beat the woman in prostitution, he will still come back here in the workplace. It's possible that he can beat us, his colleagues, and rape us. It's still possible that he can go home to his wife and start doing the same thing in the community where he lives. It is still possible that we are now posing a risk. It's not just an issue around the women in prostitution, but it's an issue around society. And of course, women in prostitution, we dream of a life living not as a key population, but as human beings, equal citizens. We want to participate not as a key population or as a vulnerable population. We want to be able to participate in everything as full citizens like everybody else.
Really good.
Thank you.
Cynthia wanted to say something.
I think it is very important to implicate not just patriarchy but also misogyny. I think patriarchy is one side of the coin, misogyny is the other side of the coin. And the fact, for instance, that the lawmakers have drafted a law in India which does not take into account the fact that the active agent in this whole transaction, if you please, is the man, because he's the one who's offering the goods which will make the transaction possible. And he is the active agent, and he is he's the big part of the problem, and he needs to be addressed in the law. The fact that he doesn't exist in the law points to institutional misogyny in our legal systems. And I think this has to be clearly called out. And we really need to become more vocal on this, to think also the people who advocate these issues need to understand from this perspective that what Meji has so brilliantly just explained, that it's not just about our bodies, it's our entire being. And another point, we haven't spoken about this, a lot of women do it for their children. What impact is this happening, is it doing upon the children, the woman's children? Because I know that I have read accounts of men who were the children, men and women or children, boys and girls, who have been children of women in prostitution. So they're playing in the house, suddenly the customer comes, or the child is sent out. And he has to wait till the customer goes. And the boy, after a while, begins to understand what is going on. And it becomes later and later in the night when he can go back to sleep or to study. Imagine what it is doing to his studies, his own self-image. So it's an intergenerational impact that these things have. We need to understand this. And children who have no part in this whole thing, this whole sad business, are also going to be very seriously victimized. Shouldn't we think about this as well?
Yes.
Last question. I think time is running out.
So we have a question from the audience.
Oh, you have a question from the audience? Great. Okay, SOA and then the audience question.
Mine, in a certain sense, is not really that much of a question, but just issues that kind of comes to my mind when we're discussing this. Because I've had occasion to debate a woman on the other side who says she chose prostitution because it's this, it's that, and everything. And we find out that she says we need to decriminalize so we can protect women in prostitution. And I say, how do you protect them in prostitution if the people who do harm to her are still going to be there? They are the ones who, instead of being, answerable to the law, they are no longer answerable, and they can do even more harm. So why don't we shift the discourse from, because when you talk of prostitution, the first equation is women. Let's shift the discourse to the invisible side, the side we don't see, that are the buyers. Why don't we shift the discourse? When you do that, things become very evident. And the question is not about sex in reality. It's about power. When you listen to interviews that have been done with the buyers, they're not really talking so much about sex as about the sense of power. They are the ones who are empowered, because then things, that kind of power they normally don't have, they now have this other person they can, oppress. And that is also part of what we need to look. And then the third thing is the question of dignity. When you read our constitutions, the right to dignity, I am still to see or hear, even from those who say, oh, we are being liberated, they never talk of these acts giving them dignity. And when we talk of work, what gives dignity? So you cannot say this thing that actually removes dignity from the human person, because as they say, oh, it's a job like any other job. No, it's not a job like any other job, because we are talking about the most intimate and sacred part of the person that is put in the marketplace. And then you turn around and say, oh, well, it's a job like any other job because it's a service. But it's not a service. It's not something that is external to the person. It's that person that is there. So I think the more we talk about shifting the discourse and moving the attention to the invisible side, which are the buyers, the men, because the greater majority, and we are not talking of just 5-10%, we're talking of over 99% of buyers are men. We need to shift the discourse there, and you see things will change immediately, because then the question of patriarchal societies that recognize that sense of entitlement of men is now being brought into question. So that was what I just wanted to
Thank you. What's the question from the
So we have Tony Moss who wants to ask, do you agree that child education on this issue can be one of the main drivers to eradicate sex trafficking in the long run?
Yes, I agree that education can be a huge driver, both of men, women, and their children. To break the cycle of intergenerational prostitution, it's important to get the children into schools where they are far away from the red light districts, the brothels, and the traffickers. To educate men who are buying sex, to make sure they understand the consequences of this purchase of sex to the women and to themselves, the kind of toxic masculinity which is driving it. And to educate our sisters in the women's movement is also equally important, and to educate society at large, because they have to also understand the consequences to the most marginalized and vulnerable women of prostitution. They don't get it at all. And to society at large, because when we use the word decriminalizing, I think it's really important for any lay person to ask the person talking to you when they use the word decriminalizing of prostitution, are they talking about decriminalizing prostituted women, or are they talking about decriminalizing pimps, traffickers, and buyers, sex buyers? It's really important to be able to differentiate this.
So we have one more question from the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. How do you address people who argue that there should not be a focus on ending demand?
Who wants to answer that question? Okay, you go. Let's go first and then you next. Okay.
I think this is a very important question, and this is the implicit understanding is that men are entitled to sex when they want it, how they want it. That implicit sense of male privilege is what we need to call out at this stage. And women are not expected, or women do not, go after sex in quite this manner, I would say, in general. So what is it that makes it possible for men to behave in this manner and just throw a little money and do what they like? It is because of this sense of entitlement and the way in which patriarchy shapes men to exercise their sexuality as and when they like it. So we really need to understand that sexuality is one important part of being a human being, and men, and particularly the younger generation, need to be, trained in how they cannot use their bodies, to exploit another person. They cannot use their money to exploit another person. They cannot use their gender, to exploit the other. And so I think as a society we have erred greatly in permitting this situation to continue. And perhaps the older generations, in our past, which were more strict in certain of the rules of behavior, I think it's important that we bring those points back into reality and into practice, social practice.
I would have just wanted to say that we need to understand that when women or girls so-called decide to go and sell sex, we don't recruit men and say, I'm going to be starting this new business now, so please come and buy sex tonight because I'll be standing at Beach Road in Sea Point. It is merely the fact that there are men waiting in Sea Point to purchase women and girls. The fact that I am able to go there and look for money when I desperately need so. And again, this is now a gateway for human trafficking. These people that traffic with these women and girls do not simply do so to just keep them and to just advertise that I've got 40 girls waiting to be bought here. No, they do so because there's a demand on the other end waiting to purchase these women and girls. So we need to understand, even when we inter-recruit amongst ourselves in prostitution, when older women recruit younger girls, we do so because there's a demand for younger girls and not a demand for older women. Right. And that is why we need to address demand. And I would like to bring us to there is this phenomenon in South Africa where there is a blesser-blessee relationship. It's what used to be known as sugar daddies, I think, yes. But now it's called blesser-blessee. And this for me is a gateway into sex, prostitution and sex trafficking. because there's a girl with limited affordability, yes, I mean, but the basic needs are well taken care of and they are able to go to school. But because there's a man with more money, when I cannot offer my daughter Sisipo an iPhone X, there is a man who's waiting to offer Sisipo an iPhone X in return for sex. And this is a discouragement for Sisipo to finish school, even when she could have finished school. And it is because of the demand. Because this man is usually older than her, has, you know, and now he portrays myself and her father to be these nasty, you know, parents who do not wish her well. And this is again why we need to address demand, because this is when these things are happening. No woman who gets into prostitution first issue around flyers and says, I will be standing at that street corner, so please men, come and buy. You go there and you find men that are already there waiting to purchase sex, and that is why people get into prostitution in the first place. Even in situations where they could have done something else, it is because there is a demand for this, and it's quite unfortunate that this is inherently harmful, it is exploitative, and it doesn't just affect the woman who is in this and the man who is in this. There are other parties that are involved. There is the man's family. In South Africa, when we look at, you know, the HIV prevalence, we 19.8 of new infections of HIV are prostitution related, and that says to say it's either the person who is selling sex, the men who purchase sex, and the partners of those men, and the partners of these individuals. So it's not just a situation of it's just there, it's there, and that's where it happens. We go there and we do what we want to do. Those of us who sell sex and those of us who buy sex, we come back to the community and bring all the problems into the community. So people just need to understand that we need to end the demand, and I'm looking at it is that everything has had to end when there was no money to do it. So let's close the tap of the money in prostitution so that there isn't anything to fuel it.
That's it. Just a small thing, because feminist group didn't just say, oh, we're going to help victims of sexual abuse and that's it. They say, no, we have to like look at all the links and all what is making men sexually abuse women, and we were going to stop like sexual violence, and we're not just going to make we're going to met and what is your emotion. That is so important, but also to change society, and it's always have been so. Ending the demand, it's the same thing, it's just another focus. And women lack money, and the money is somewhere, and we have to redistribute this money in order, to fully end the demand, because they have money to buy women, and money don't have it. But it's not, because prostitution is not a way to redistribute to women, and it should not be, and we have to find other ways. So for me, it's
yes. Right. I would love to add one tiny thing too. Demand, for me, I see as a really simple supply and demand marketing equation. I mean, right, if down at the local store, Dasani was selling out like hotcakes, that store owner would put in more orders of Dasani because that was what was being requested, right? And so if there is a lot of supply, if there's a lot of demand for youthful flesh, traffickers will find a way to supply that demand. They're the ones. And I think what's so important for men to understand is men, they're following you. Like, traffickers are following you. They're looking at where large groups of men are congregating alone, especially men with expendable income. They're researching online, at least in America. Traffickers are researching online, where's the next conference, where's the next stockholders event, where's the next March Madness going to be, and they're following you. You are you're their demographic to market to. They're not moving victims to keep them disoriented and not know where they are. They're moving victims because they're following men, because that's the buyer. And so if our men who want to protect and stand up for women and children understood that they are being followed and tracked, just like by predators, by traffickers, to find, oh, I could parade these girls around in the stockholders conference. If men knew that, would they be a little bit more on guard? If good men who wanted to stand up and defend and protect, if they knew they were being followed, would they think about it a little bit differently? I was with retired Lieutenant Andre Dawson, who was an incredible man. We were in California, he recently passed, so I'm sorry, I'm emotional. We were in LA, and we met at this restaurant to have lunch before we were going to do this event. And as soon as we walked in, it was a stockholders conference. The room was saturated with mainly men, because it's a predominantly male industry, saturated with men in very nice suits with clearly a lot of expendable income. Andre and I walk in for lunch and we stopped, we looked at each other, we went, boy, will there be pimps here tonight. Right? Because we knew that traffickers are looking for that type of location so they can parade their victims into, because our culture that sells sex with everything is permeating our younger generation to normalize and glamorize and be desensitized to sex for sale in every facet. And if we're not more thoughtful around how is this advertisement affecting my 4-year-old little boy or girl into thinking that it's normal to sell sex for a hamburger or for this or for that. Like, we have to be more, I think, thoughtful around just the industry of glamorizing sex for sale as a whole. And I wish men knew more that they were being targeted by traffickers.
So with these powerful words, thank you for being a wonderful audience and sitting through this, and thank you for all of you who watched it on Facebook. Thank you.